Well, a warm welcome to all our listeners joining us from around the world. I'm Andrew Zalewski, and I'm truly delighted to be today together in this conversation with good friend Tony Kahane, who is joining us from London. Welcome, Tony.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and I'm pleased to be talking to you and eventually to our listeners and members of Gesher Galicia.
Tony, your contributions to the field of Jewish genealogy, and particularly Galician genealogy, they don't require a long introductions, but let me roll some key dates. Tony joined Gesher Galicia in early 2000, and importantly was the chair leading the board of directors of Gesher Galicia between 2015 and 2019. And as we all benefited from Tony's activities between 2015 and earlier this year, 2022, Tony spearheaded research efforts being a research coordinator for Gesher Galicia, and we'll talk a little bit more about research contributions in our podcast a little bit later. But Tony, let's begin our conversation with maybe a little bit of your personal journey to family history research. Maybe tell us a little bit about ancestral towns that are linked to your initial inroads to genealogy.
Thank you, Andrew. Yes, probably like many people, not everyone, like many people, my active interest in genealogy started relatively late, probably when I was in my 50s. I'd been interested before in a very sort of amateurish way or occasional way, shall we say. But it was only, and this happens, I think, quite often, it's only after one's grandparents are no longer there, and often your parents too, or if they're still alive, they may not be perhaps in a state to remember things well or to talk about them, which was the case with me. And it was only really in the early 2000s that I started to take a more direct interest. And in the first place, my father was no longer alive, my mother was still alive then. The first place, I went to places that my mother's ancestors had come from in the Czech Republic, later Vienna, but originally in the Czech Republic, specifically to the rather enchanting town of Mikulov, or Nikolsburg in German, in southern Moravia, near very close, almost on the border with the present-day border with Austria, and to Prague, where my mother's father's family had come from. Mother's father actually was born in Vienna, but his parents had come from Prague, and they'd been there for quite a few generations. So in 2003, I visited the Czech Republic, Prague, and Brno, and Nikolsburg in Mikulov. And I went to some archives in that year, and 3 years later, when I visited again, the National Archives in Prague, the Jewish Museum archives in Prague, both of which have many records from the whole of Jewish records from the whole of the former Bohemia and Moravia. And so that was really the start of that.
A long journey, I'm sure. Yes,
that journey.
Yes.
And it was very, and of course, it's very exciting at first. And we'll talk more about some of the obstacles, but in those days,
What about Galicia? What about Galicia?
Well, Galicia, I mean, my father was born in Zbaroš, in the far east of Galicia. As you know better than I, it was a town that almost didn't make it into Austrian Galicia.
Yeah, I think we have to tell our listeners our internal joke. In 1773, Emperor Joseph II was visiting recently annexed Galicia, annexed to the Austrian monarchy, and there was some dispute where the border should be situated, in the border separating Galicia to further eastern territories that would ultimately become part of Imperial Russia. And I'm always joking, Tony, that we almost lost you, and only by good deeds of the emperor, he moved the border about 10, 20 miles to the east. So I think the Jewish genealogy, particularly Jewish genealogy of Galicia, benefited from the imperial action.
Well, that's very kind of you, and I'm sure the emperor would be.
Yes.
If he were alive today, would be pleased to hear you say that. So yes, Galicia. Well, my father had told me a little bit about. I mean, he was born in Zbaroš in January 1914, a few months before the start of the First World War, and he left as a baby, really, with his parents. And other members of the family, one set of grandparents and other aunts and uncles, for Vienna, and some of the larger family returned to Zbaroš in about 1921-22, after the war and the post-war fighting in the area. But his parents and my father stayed in Vienna. He talked a bit. He did visit Zbaroš as a young man. He was about 20, probably made early visits to see his grandparents. He told me a little bit about it, but he mentioned Tarnopol as the large town nearby. And I was reasonably interested, but then you put it aside, and later you sort of wished you'd asked more or made notes,
right?
And that's always the way. So that was the original
Tony,
connection. I went to. I joined Gesher Galicia, I think, in the early 2000s. Certainly by 2006, when I went to the conference in New York, the IAGGS conference. I was a member by then, and but it was still very new to everything, and it was quite an exciting time. The discoveries. I then went to Warsaw and Krakow and to Lviv in 2010, and that was perhaps the start of the more on the ground.
So Tony, when you look back at this early brush with genealogy, tell us what were the growing pains that you experienced, or what obstacles you faced at that time when you were trying to reconstruct your own family history?
Well, I mean, things that in those days, and it's not so long ago, but the level of digitization, of computerization was very much less, at least of things online. I mean, there were guidelines on various sites about where to find records and how to deal with them. But it was very much a question of somehow getting to the records in the archive, and searching them, and in a way that was exciting, because you were dealing with the raw records. Even if some cases they were microfilm data, but in those days, both in Czech Republic and in Poland, the record books I looked at were the real books, and so that was. But there were frustrations. That, I mean, if you're looking at a book of births from Prague. I mean, it was horrendous, probably a bit like Lvov in Poland.
Yes, yes.
Hundreds and hundreds, and you have the same people,
Yes.
different people with similar names.
Right.
And,
Right.
so there were problems there, I mean, obvious ones. I suppose another problem was it's always a case that you knew a person was born at a certain time, and you're fairly certain they were born in that town, but you couldn't. There was no record for them, and
Right.
that happens to them. It's the frustrations of doing
Yes.
that.
And also, I think for our listeners and for all of us,
yes.
at the first years of our own research, another level of difficulties when we double in Galician research is very complex. Political history changes in names of the towns. Today's split between Polish and Ukrainian side, which at the beginning adds another level of challenges.
Yes.
Wouldn't you agree with that?
Well, yeah, certainly. I mean, the Galician records are the ones that have survived, and many, of course, were lost over the 150 years, particularly during the First and Second World Wars and the aftermaths of those wars. But as you said, particularly from Eastern Galicia, there are records in Warsaw at AGAD. We might talk about AGAD later. There are records in Przemysl, close to the border between Poland and Ukraine, and there are records in Lviv.
It defies the sense of geography sometimes,
yes.
where you can find those records. Yeah, so on this note, Tony, let's maybe fast forward now to your tenure as a chair and as particularly a research coordinator for Gesher Galicia. There are so many activities that we can bring here to the discussion, but I will ask you which particular activities you are particularly proud of. I'm sure there is a big bucket of items that you can bring, but give us maybe some sample of those.
Talking generally, and I'd say that what we achieved, and I think we achieved something in these years. First of all, it was continuation of work done earlier by predecessors. Pamela Weisberger, president before. I was chair, and other members, early members of the board. And during the time, it was also a collaborative effort, particularly with people like you and Jay Osborne and Mark Jacobson and others from our research team at Gesher Galicia. I think the fact that I was able to visit, wasn't absolutely necessary, but I was able to visit quite often archives, the Warsaw in particular, and we had still have some very good collaborators there. If I may mention people, I'd certainly mention Piotr Gomola, who's done an awful lot in many ways, and in some of the special projects which we will talk about. Pavel Malinowski, who's now in recent years become our IT guru, IT manager, and has done great things, and our colleagues at AGAD, including Slavik, Kostek, and I mean there are others. I can't mention everybody, but the collaboration with them, and from that the collaboration with other archives in Poland where we visited. We don't necessarily have very close relationships with them all, but Przemysl particularly, we've developed a close relationship, and we'll probably talk about that a bit more. And AGAD, I mean, those the two, and both of those have many Eastern Galician records. And at the same time, the collaboration, which has become much stronger in the last 3 or 4 years, despite the pandemic and sadly despite the
war,
war in Ukraine, is the collaboration with CDL, the Central State Historical Archives of Ukraine in Lviv, one of 2 such central state historical archives in Ukraine.
Yes.
The other one being in Kyiv. And we've also got contacts with the other 2 state archives.
So, Tony, maybe for the benefit of our listeners, just from a 30,000 feet level, if someone has ancestry related to Eastern Galicia, where those records could be found in terms of the archives, and then maybe mention briefly if someone has ancestry related to Western Galicia.
Well, I think the answer really, and this was something that in the early days was generally lacking, at least as in a single place, and that's a technological development to do with the inventory of records that Gesher Galicia has built up, and I think that is really something that we can all be, not just me, be very proud of. It's to say, I haven't seen anything else comparable elsewhere for Jewish Galicia. That it started in a very small way, probably more than 10 years ago, when there was a sort of inventory and more like a Excel table which was put online of the records in Lviv, the ones that the Mormons had microfilmed, and it was just relating their microfilm numbers to the records, and we didn't even use archival reference numbers. That sort of developed, and we added files from AGAD, which were well inventoried already by AGAD, and then in more recent years, particularly after Pavel took over with the IT work, we developed a series of online inventories, searchable inventories for the different Polish and Ukrainian archives, and so that started to become comprehensive. Trouble was, it was a little bit fragmented. It was reasonably sophisticated, not incredibly sophisticated, but you had to search through different parts of the inventory for different archives. And it's probably only 2 or 3 years ago now that there was a move which you yourself spearheaded, I think, putting a lot of effort into working with Pavel to create a single unified inventory
of records,
and
right?
this,
yes.
I think is very good now. I mean, it's the difficulty is really to keep it updated and make sure that new records that come in, new books that arrive at an archive, perhaps from a civil registration office, books that were previously withheld for privacy reasons, that these are added. But even so, we are still finding odd records that we didn't know existed.
Exactly.
We didn't know, I mean, perhaps other people did, but I didn't know until quite recently that the State Archive in Katowice, which is not in Galicia, but it's not very far, has Jewish vital records from 2 towns that weren't Galicia.
Incredible, yes.
And so we've added that. We know of 1 or 2 other peripheral archives that either were not, where the archive is not in Galicia or it's just on the border, which also hold Jewish vital records from Galician towns. But the Katowice one was a recent discovery.
So I think this is a great example that I think we all should remind ourselves from time to time whenever the question comes to our mind whether certain records survived from this or another town, that now we have, as you said, this tool that is accessible to all on a website of Gesher Galicia, that we can find whether any records survived, if they survived, what type of records, where they are located in terms of in which archives, and also something that you perhaps will get in a moment. It also, the inventory provides information whether those records were in fact indexed by one of many genealogical organizations, not only Gesher Galicia. So I think we have one place, in a sense, that we can cross-reference and check the status of those ancestral records. Yeah.
If I can add one further
Please, yes.
benefit of the inventory is that we already have many scans of records attached to the inventory, linked from the inventory. Some of them, many of them are records that the Polish State Archives website has. In other words, state archives in Poland are supposed to be gradually digitizing their records, not just Jewish ones, and sending for upload to the website of the Polish State Archives, which at the present moment is down, actually, but that's another matter. Hopefully come back before too long. So those are records from Polish archives. There are many that haven't been digitized yet, but its position is sort of a lot more advanced than it was even just a few years ago. We also have our own scans from many records, and those we put online, linked from the inventory. For the benefit of our members. It's only for members. The ones from the Polish State Archive, or the ones from the AGAD website, are available for everyone, and they should be.
Now listening to your reflection on this topic, I'm also increasingly become aware and appreciate the fact that genealogy is continuously expanding, not only in discovery of the new records, as you mentioned, but also in exploring different variety of records, right? From vital records, that is this bread and butter of family history research, to increasing number of different types of records. And again, to your earlier points, those records are also found in the inventories.
Very much so. There's a very good set of Josephine and Franciscan cadastral survey records, a project which you yourself managed over a number of years, and particularly property records from towns, property records from that period, from the late 18th century and early 19th century, from towns that may not have had many surviving vital records. And those are all indexed, they're on the inventories, and all the scans from them are on the inventory too. I'd also mention that our aim is to have all the scans of all the vital records that we've indexed. And I think that is, with a few that are going up very soon, I think that is virtually done. But of course, we want to have a lot more than that. And it's the same is true with the Josephine cadastral and Franciscan survey records. That we've got the scans for all those. we've got the scans from most of the taxpayer records, Jewish taxpayer records from the 1920s and 1930s, which also provide additional information, voters' records from the period. I recently, I mentioned that, as always, there's information you cannot find, which should be in the records and isn't there. And one case early on was that of a great grandmother from Zbarash, and I couldn't find her birth record at all. I could find it from all her many siblings and her parents, but not from Leah Zalewski herself. And not long ago, we obtained some scans of voters' records from Zbarash from the 1930s, and that gave her date of birth. And, and those will be indexed soon. And we're also doing voter records from Zborov and Skarwat.
And that's another example that research into the records is not just mundane and very tedious. Yes, that is true for in some cases, but we are always waiting for that moment of the sudden discovery that a little scribble on a record or some information that we were not aware that existed suddenly is uncovered. So I think this is absolutely true, that from this global discovery to personal discoveries and back to global discoveries, this is a wonderful a journey through genealogy. So we talked a little bit about dispersion of the records. Tony, you highlighted creating a professional approach to indexing of records to our team in Poland, but also in Ukraine, of research collaborators and Gesher Galicia representatives. You talked about technology improvements such as inventories. As our listeners are acutely aware, for a number of years, Tony, you've been very good contributor and loyal contributor to our journal, The Galitzianer, publishing on a quarterly basis research updates. So I'm tempted to ask you, is there any paper that you published in The Galitzianer yourself that particularly you are either proud of or you think provided greater contribution vis-a-vis the rest?
Well, I think we had a series, in fact, you commissioned them, I think, or your successor, Jody, as Jody Benjamin, your successor as editor, commissioned a number of tutorial articles related to genealogical research. I don't know whether I'm so proud of it, but I think what we should mention here is not just an article that I wrote, but a companion article that appeared in the same journal. My own article was called Understanding Vital Records, and it was in the Journal of September 2020. That's volume 27, number 3. And it was a tutorial on understanding vital records. Alongside it, Mark Jacobson had an article, which I think was very much went with it.
Yes.
On databases for Galician genealogy. And those two, I think, were probably the ones you are perhaps have in mind.
Yes.
I should say that my own article and particularly referenced very much an excellent article that you had written in June 2017, so that was about 3 years earlier, on entitled Galician Vital Records, Legal evolution, and that really was a sort of fundamental article for much that followed. Perhaps the article that I don't know if I'm allowed to mention more than one, but the article that I most enjoyed writing, I don't know if people enjoyed reading it so much, was in March this year, March 2022, on Galicia's early period.
Yes, a fascinating period. Yes.
About the partitions, and we included the story that you mentioned about as well.
Well, maybe it's worth it to remind our listeners that whenever you want to tap to the past issues of Galitzianer, you can, by logging in from Gesher Galicia website, you can easily access Galitzianer archives in portal, in a members portal, and then certainly Tony's article and other articles can be easily found there. We will be wrapping shortly this discussion. So Tony, I want us to look a little bit forward. As you look a bit into the future, can you give us one or two examples of perhaps innovations or ideas that you hope will become down the line the part of Jewish genealogy?
Yes, I mean, I think some of these are already ongoing. We talked about the importance of having scans available, and they can be made available online now. This wasn't the case very easily 20 years ago, but it can be done now. And we have been, as I said, we've been making scans available from Eastern Galicia, vital records. I think more or less all of them now. It's also up to the archives in Poland to continue that. And the scans of index books, something I only realized recently, are themselves very important. In a way, it's if you can't index a full record book, but you have the images there, just scans of the index book of that book, if the index book exists, is itself a very valuable tool, because it's almost equivalent to having a index set of records online. So that's something we are, I know Mark and the team are looking into, particularly with regard to index books of Lvov records.
Yes.
There's so many Lvov records, full books of vital records.
Right.
And it's very difficult for all our groups to index them all.
Or manually look page by page. That's
especially the images to look page by page. But if you have an index book,
of course,
and then that helps. So I mean, that's an existing technology. I suppose one thing, it still sounds a bit like science fiction, is sort of artificial intelligence reading handwriting.
Yes.
We have for typed characters, we have optical character recognition, but for handwriting there are experiments. It's been developed to a certain extent. It's still not, I think, terribly good from the little I know about it, but if people write very clearly, which generally they don't in the books we're looking at, whatever their style is, as long as it's a consistent style, then the computer should be able to.
And that would be of tremendous value, not only because it is challenging to decipher handwriting, but also another part of Galician records is multilingual character of those records, right? From German to Polish, occasionally even in Cyrillic alphabet, but mostly German and Polish, and certainly German cursive is not very friendly to reading in 21st century. Yeah. Tony, so can you maybe give us your perspective? Do you think, is there any type of records or set of Jewish records that remains stubbornly hidden? In other words, what records you would like to see unearthed by Mark Jacobson and our colleagues in Gesher Galicia in the next few years or the next few decades? I put a little challenge for Mark.
Well, that's good. Yes, I will second that. Well, there are records that still haven't been handed over from civil registration offices, USC offices in yes. Poland. In small towns around Poland, they keep records until they are ready to be released 100 years after births. For birth book has to be at least 100 years old and 80 years old for marriage and death books. Now, with the marriage and death books, we're in 2022 now. Next year, all the marriage and death vital records in Poland of any religion should have been released from the civil registration office to the local regional archive, and that seems to be happening reasonably from what I can judge. But there is an exception there, that there's a special civil registration office in Warsaw that deals with all the many, or originally there were very many books of records that arrived in a rather chaotic state after the war from the eastern part of Galicia, the part that was then incorporated into the Soviet Union. And some of them went to AGAD, others went to this special office, because they were not supposed to be released yet under the privacy laws. And they weren't just Jewish records, they came from the Eastern Territories, the former Eastern Territories of interwar Poland. The Jewish ones only came from the Eastern Galician provinces. But some of the Roman Catholic and Greek Catholic and other Protestant records came from further north, in areas that are now further north in Ukraine or in Belarus. And they are supposed to be handing those over too as they become available, but there's been a lot of backsliding, I think, for various reasons, various excuses, some of them more understandable, like the pandemic. Right. But they are really quite behind on for a while, for a few years. 2016, 17, 18, they were doing quite well, and they had transfers once or twice a year, and they were more or less keeping up with what they should have been doing. And since then, there's been very little in the last.
Well, I have no doubt that Mark and his team will have a lot to.
I think they will have to shake them up.
Yes. And Tony, I think that I'm delighted that although you pulled back from day-to-day activities with the board and with the research, but I know from our private conversations and from other activities that I see popping up through Gesher Galicia that your passion for genealogy continues. I know that you recently visited Poland and visited some archives. I don't think I will reveal this as a secret that you also plan the visit to Ukraine when the situation becomes more stable. And I'm sure those visits solidify Gesher Galicia's research activities, for which we are very grateful. Tony, perhaps on this note, I want to thank you for chatting with us today. I can clearly sense at the end of this conversation that we have so many other topics that we probably should leave for part 2 of our conversation to come back. So thank you very much, Tony. We wish you health. And again, much appreciation for your outstanding work in the field of Jewish genealogy. Thank you very much, Tony.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, a great pleasure, and I look forward to part 2.